So what do we say about Carney's experience and his resume? Well, the real question is, what is he aiming at? Right, so he's got a stellar educational background and this vast experience on the international side. But the question is, what has he concluded from that? And what has he done in consequence? And what is he planning to do in the future? Now, I read Carney's book, Values, very, very carefully. And so the reason I want to walk you through that is because that's his carefully thought through statement of principles and aims. And so it's useful to take a person at his word on the written side. And so I think we can derive from values what Carney's values are, what values he thinks Canadians do and should hold, what we can conclude about what he's already done for Canada and on the international stage, and where things are headed in the future. And so now I'm going to take Carney's values book apart in two ways. The first thing I want to tell you is what he thinks Canadians' values are. Okay, so he's setting himself up as an arbiter of the Canadian ethos. And to do that in his book, in the first couple of chapters, and then at the end of the book, he tells us all what makes Canada the country that it is. And so we want to delve into that. All right, so Carney's conclusion with regards to Canada's core values are a leftist, utopian, globalist view of the Western tradition. So he believes, for example, that the core Canadian values are fairness and equity, resilience and adaptability, sustainability and responsibility, and community and cooperation. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to do, those are all terms that sound positive and that could, in principle, bring people together on the basis of a vision. Fairness and equity, resilience and adaptability, sustainability and responsibility, community and cooperation. But the first thing I'd like to point out to all of you who are listening is that although Carney claims that those are core Canadian values, that claim is not correct. Those are core globalist, socialist, utopian, net zero promoting environmentalist values. But the core Canadian values are actually derived from the Judeo-Christian, Western, broadly Western, and English common law tradition. And so I'm going to outline what those are, just so you can see the contrast between those values, which are the true Canadian values, and Carney's values, which have this patina or aura of high-flown positive emotion, but bear little relationship to the genuine historical reality and do not describe the values that made Canada the wealthy, free, productive Western democracy that it is. So Canada is actually founded on the principles of individual liberty and rights, the rule of law, equality and justice. And equality there doesn't mean equality of outcome, and it doesn't mean economic equality. It means equality of value before the law and equality of opportunity and responsibility and order. And so those are values that are very different than the value set that Carney is putting forward. And so then you might ask, if Carney didn't derive what he believes Canadian values to be from the historical reality of Canada, from what source did he derive his values? Now, you also might wonder why it's important to even delve into this. And well, the first conclusion we could draw is that Carney wouldn't have written a whole book about values if he didn't think that it was important to delve into values. And he certainly wouldn't have written a book revealing his own values if he didn't think it was important to communicate to Canadians and people around the world what he thinks Canadian values and his values are and should be. So my focus on values, although I certainly believe, as he does, that values are fundamentally important, I'm focusing on values because that's the focus that Carney himself chose. All right, so this is where we can link the facts of his resume to an analysis of his genuine motivations. So let's first look in more detail at how Carney translates his core values into the beginnings of policy. All right, so Carney, in his book Values, outlines his support for three of what I regard as the least credible ideas that have emerged on the international landscape and the intellectual landscape in the last 20 years. So first of all, he's an explicit advocate of the diversity, equity, and inclusivity principles that have destroyed the modern universities, that have corrupted our judiciary and our political institutions, and that have allowed the liberals to smuggle, the modern federal liberals, to smuggle in what's essentially a relatively radical leftist agenda under the guise of classical liberalism. Diversity, inclusivity, and equity, the DEI holy trinity, is a political policy movement predicated on the idea that Western society, and that would include Canada, is a corrupt patriarchy in its essence that marginalizes a variety of groups, and purposefully so, delegitimizing them, and that the appropriate response to that is to segregate and identify people on the basis of their group identity, and that would include race and sex and gender and all the other isms, all the other ism identities that you may have heard in the last 10 years, to divide people on the basis of those identities and to privilege the marginalized, to bring them to the center. Now, some of that presumption derives from postmodern philosophy, and some of it is essentially Marxist in its orientation. And so Carney's derivation of Canadian values, when the pedal hits the metal, let's say, or the rubber hits the road, the manner in which Carney translates his interpretation of Canadian values is the same manner that the radical leftists in the Democratic Party, for example, in the United States, translated the same value propositions. And that's to become an advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusivity, and to assume that human beings should be divided on the basis of their race and their sexual identity and their gender, etc., and that our culture is essentially oppressive at its core. And so I believe that idea to be discreditable across multiple dimensions of analysis, and it's certainly the case that it was roundly rejected by the American electorate in the last election cycle. And you can also see that the Democrats themselves in the United States are backpedaling rapidly on the DEI front because they realize that it's a losing game in the short, medium, and long run. And so the first thing we might note is that when Carney is trying to formulate policy, one of the sets of policies that he put forward include this discreditable and divisive DEI formulation that's been part and parcel of the maneuvers by intellectuals to tilt the entire political world in a radically revolutionary and leftist direction.